Theodor Herzl was born on the 2nd of May 1860 in the Jewish quarter of the Hungarian city of Pest. He grew up in a wealthy merchant family where German was spoken. The family belonged to the liberal neolog movement and practiced Judaism only to a very limited extent. The young Theodor, too, adopted the values of his largely assimilated family and enjoyed an exceptionally good education, which introduced him to the culture of the German-speaking world, to which he was to retain a strong attachment until the end of his life. At the age of 18, Herzl moved to Vienna, where he began studying law. Although he obtained his doctorate in 1884, which would have paved the way for a successful career as a lawyer, he had discovered a flair for writing and decided to pursue this passion instead. He wrote around a dozen plays, which, whilst receiving some attention, did not bring him any great success. His career as a journalist, however, was far more promising, and in 1891 he was appointed as the Paris correspondent for the liberal Neue Freie Presse, one of Austria's most prestigious and widely read newspapers. 5 years later, he even rose to the position of literary editor, thereby becoming one of the most influential figures in Vienna's publishing scene. Overall, Herzl's life story resembled that of countless other Jews in Vienna who believed that they were living through the happiest period in their history. The Austrian constitution of 1867 had granted Jews full equality with all other citizens, and all the restrictions that had been in place for centuries had suddenly been lifted. Many Jews from Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, Galicia and Bukovina took advantage of the freedom of residence granted to them and sought their fortune in the capital. As a result, Vienna's Jewish population grew rapidly. Whereas around 6,200 Jewish people had lived there before emancipation, by 1900 the figure had risen to 147,000, most of whom spoke German or Yiddish. With all doors now open to Jews, many of them were spurred on to achieve great things in the late 19th century. Particularly in higher education, Jewish students were soon far more numerously represented than their actual proportion of the population. Medicine and law were particularly popular subjects, as they paved the way for careers as doctors and lawyers. But Jews also enjoyed great success in business, as evidenced by the opulent, ostentatious buildings along the Ringstraße, where numerous Jewish banking and entrepreneurial families such as the Tedescos, Wertheims and Efrosis made their homes. The majority of Vienna's Jewish middle class and upper classes were closely linked to German culture and language. They saw themselves, first and foremost, as Germans, and their Jewish faith was of secondary importance to them, or even completely insignificant. Numerous intellectuals such as the composer Gustav Mahler, the doctor Sigmund Freud, and the writers Arthur Schnitzler and Stefan Zweig played their part in making Vienna one of the world's most culturally significant cities. Many, but certainly not all Viennese of Jewish background were convinced that the days of Judaism in Western Europe were numbered. Through assimilation, education and conversion, the old-fashioned Jewish faith was destined to become a relic of the past, they believed. The young Theodor Herzl also shared this belief in assimilation, and he too harboured a strong aversion to all things Jewish. In 1882, he wrote that the Jews had a crooked morality, a lack of ethical seriousness, and that they were financial leeches. However, he also emphasized that these negative traits were not inherent, but instead the result of centuries-long Christian oppression and could be overcome. Forced into ghettos, excluded and compelled to perform menial labour, the Jews were historically never given the opportunity to reflect on morality, culture or social progress. Now, however, that all these barriers had been removed, it was, according to Herzl, only a matter of time before the Jews would blend into mainstream German society and finally abandon their negative traits. The hopes of many Austrian Jews that emancipation would bring them a carefree and prosperous life were dashed by the emergence of modern anti-Semitism. In 1873, the stock market in Vienna crashed, and it was to take over 2 decades for the economy to recover fully from this shock. Many people, particularly those from the middle classes, feared for their prosperity and began to look with envy on Jewish immigrants who, despite the economic difficulties, were able to build impressive careers for themselves. Furthermore, in the late 19th century, Vienna developed into an industrial city at a pace that many simply could not keep up with. Many traditional craftsmen felt threatened by mass production in the factories. Many business people saw the newly built department stores as crushing competition, and members of the upper middle classes worried about the proletarianization and degradation of the city. A scapegoat was therefore needed, and as so often in human history, the Jews had to bear the brunt of the blame, being vilified as capitalists, stock market Jews, or the liberal elite. The first country in which anti-Semitism was able to emerge as an organized political movement was Germany. In 1879, the well-known Berlin historian Heinrich von Treitschke wrote an anti-Jewish essay in which he blamed the Jews for all the problems in the country and called for their social influence to be curtailed. At the same time, the influential court chaplain Adolf Stöcker founded his Christian Social Party and called for the reversal of the Jews' emancipation, which in the German Empire had not even been fully achieved. One of the most radical voices was that of Eugen Dühring, who in his 1881 treatise, The Jewish Question as a Question of Race, Morals and Culture, used pseudo-scientific explanations to define the Jews as a distinct race that was, by its very nature, eternally hostile to the German people. Endowed with a supposedly serious veneer by these prominent figures, these anti-Semitic pipe dreams eventually found their way to Austria, where they fell on fertile ground. Anti-Semitism managed to spread rapidly, particularly at the universities, because unlike the traditional Christian anti-Judaism, it was regarded as modern and scientifically grounded. Non-Jewish students blamed their Jewish fellow students for the shortage of jobs and accused them of snatching up all the best university places and positions. At the University of Vienna, they received support from the professor of medicine, Theodor Billroth, who wrote a book in 1876 and propagated the theory that Jews allegedly belonged to a different race and could never become German. This soon had consequences for Jewish students, as they were gradually expelled from the various student fraternities following the publication of Billroth's book. By 1890, all Viennese fraternities had ultimately declared themselves to be anti-Semitic. Theodor Herzl, too, was confronted with anti-Semitism during his university studies. He had been a long-standing member of the Albia fraternity before angrily resigning from it in 1883 following an anti-Semitic speech delivered by a member at a ceremony honouring Richard Wagner. It is definitely one of history's bitter ironies that the spread of anti-Semitism in Austria went hand in hand with the country's increasing democratization. In 1882, the right to vote was extended to include all men over the age of 24 who paid 5 gulden in tax each year. The number of eligible voters in Vienna thus tripled and now included members of the anti-capitalist middle class, precisely those people who were particularly susceptible to anti-Jewish agitation. Meanwhile, the working class itself, which was largely immune to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, remained excluded. This electoral reform paved the way for the rise of Georg von Schönerer, the leader of the German national movement, who sought to win over the so-called 5 Golden Men. Schönerer espoused an irreconcilable racial anti-Semitism and transformed the German national movement into a self-centered anti-Semitic party. He constantly incited hatred against the Jews and tabled anti-Jewish proposals in the Imperial Council. For example, he demanded that all Jewish teachers be dismissed, that the country should not take in Jewish refugees from Russia, and he advocated the nationalization of the Kaiser Ferdinand Northern Railway, which until then had been majority owned by the Rothschild banking house. In 1885, he tabled a bill in Parliament that was a direct copy of the American Chinese Exclusion Act, with the only difference being that the word Chinese had been replaced with the word Jews. The bill was, unsurprisingly, rejected by an overwhelming majority. Schönerer's agitation met with some success, particularly at universities and in certain middle-class political associations, but he was never able to build a mass movement. His political downfall came in 1888, when he and a number of supporters stormed the editorial offices of the Neues Wiener Tagblatt, which had accidentally reported the death of the German Emperor Wilhelm I prematurely. After serving his prison sentence, he was never to regain any political relevance. Someone who enjoyed far greater success was a man called Karl. With his inflammatory rhetoric, he deliberately drew on traditional Catholic anti-Judaism. Through his Christian Social Party, he espoused a form of anti-Semitism that also sought to reverse the emancipation of the Jews, but, unlike Schöneras, distanced itself from the racial element. Instead, Lueger deliberately exploited the anti-Semitic sentiment amongst the middle classes for his own political ends and incited hatred against Jews, particularly on the political, religious and economic fronts. He was probably not a convinced anti-Semite himself, but deliberately exploited every means at his disposal to secure power. His anti-Jewish insults and slogans met with great approval amongst the Viennese middle classes, and through his oratory skills, his charisma, his straightforward answers to complex contemporary issues, and his portrayal of himself as a man of the common people, he soon created a veritable cult of personality around himself. Thanks to the skewed Viennese electoral system, which disproportionately favoured the middle and upper classes, he succeeded in securing an absolute majority in the mayoral elections in April 1895. However, Kaiser Franz Joseph I refused to appoint Lueger as the mayor of the Austrian capital, as this would have jeopardized the constitutional equality of the Jews. It was only after 4 further elections, each of which boosted Lueger's popularity, that the emperor relented in 1897. Lueger remained mayor of Vienna until his death in 1910, and during his term of office, no anti-Jewish violence was instigated, nor were any anti-Jewish laws enacted. The fact that he repeatedly emphasized that he never actually took anti-Semitism seriously and merely used it as a political tool does not, however, exonerate him. Quite the contrary. Rather, it lays bare his duplicity, as well as his unscrupulousness in inciting hatred against an entire group for his own ends. With his anti-Semitic speeches, he had permanently poisoned the political atmosphere in Vienna, and Lueger succeeded in establishing anti-Semitic talking points within mainstream society. Decades later, this was to have serious consequences. But let us stick to the late 19th century. How did the Viennese Jews react to the spread of anti-Semitism? Broadly speaking, there were 3 different viewpoints. Firstly, there were the integrationists. They represented the educated Jewish middle class, saw themselves first and foremost as members of Austrian society, and sought to counter the anti-Semitic agitators with reason, logic, and arguments. By far the most important representative of this group was Josef Samuel Bloch, a rabbi originally from Galicia. Bloch had gained fame by publicly humiliating the anti-Semitic writer August Rohling. Rohling had claimed that the Talmud contained numerous quotations which allegedly demonstrated the immorality of the Jews, which he claimed had existed since the very beginning. Bloch was then able to prove publicly that Rohling did not know Hebrew and was therefore unable to even read the Talmud at all. Building on this success, in 1886 he founded, together with a number of fellow campaigners, the Austrian Israelite Union, whose aim, according to Bloch, was to precipitate joint, effective political action on all questions concerning Judaism, to influence the improvement of religious instruction, to spread knowledge about Jewish history within Jewish circles, to elevate and foster Jewish consciousness, and to create a front against the rapidly spreading Semitic anti-Semitism, and, as far as possible, to suppress all tendencies which seek to exacerbate religious and racial antagonisms. The second group consisted of the assimilationists, for whom the complete integration of Jews into Austrian culture could not happen quickly enough. Their best-known representative was Karl Kraus, who came from a Bohemian Jewish family but distanced himself from Judaism at an early age. In 1899, he finally left the Jewish community. For him, only through complete assimilation could the breeding ground for anti-Semitism be removed and peaceful coexistence finally made possible. When, in 1899, violent riots broke out in Bohemia against the local Jewish minority following the Hilsner affair, in which a Jewish cobbler was accused of the ritual murder of a young Czech girl, Kraus wrote, "It is a pity that so many decent people have to suffer as a result of the people's blind hostility. But the intensity of a movement," he means anti-Judaism, "which has remained undiminished throughout the ages, cannot be eradicated by an antiquated sense of solidarity, nor by cowardly cover-ups, nor even with the help of protesting rabbis. Only courageous cleansing within one's own ranks, only the shedding of the peculiarities of a race which, through centuries of dispersion, has long since ceased to be a nation, can put an end to all this torment. Through dissolution to redemption. Otherwise, the much vaunted 20th century will witness excesses of the worst kind. The third major group consisted of Jewish nationalists. They rejected the view that Jews could ever integrate into the surrounding cultures and instead regarded Judaism self-assuredly as a nation in its own right. A subgroup of the nationalists, the Zionists, were also convinced that Jews no longer had a future in Europe and should instead launch a colonization project in Palestine. The first Zionist association in Vienna was Kadima, or Towards the East in English, a Jewish nationalist fraternity founded in 1882 by 13 students in response to rising antisemitism at their university. The members of Kadima resisted assimilation and engaged in duels with anti-Semitic students. However, they did not necessarily call for a Jewish state, but rather for a safe haven in Palestine for Jews from Europe. Furthermore, they made it their mission to further spread Jewish national consciousness. In later years, further Zionist organizations, reading circles and clubs were founded in Vienna, although Zionism remained a very marginal movement with little support for a long time. This only changed in 1896, when Theodor Herzl published his book, The Jews' State. Why did Herzl, who had maintained an assimilationist stance for decades, become a Zionist? Herzl himself repeatedly claimed that it was the Dreyfus affair, which he had witnessed at first hand as a correspondent in Paris, that led him to adopt this stance. Just briefly, for those who are not aware, the Dreyfus affair was a judicial scandal in France triggered after the Jewish captain, Alfred Dreyfus, was accused of passing secret documents to the German Empire. Dreyfus was convicted by a court-martial in 1894 without any compelling evidence and subsequently exiled to Devil's Island. Meanwhile, the French military high command did everything in their power to cover up for the true traitor, Major Ferdinand Valsin-Esterhazy. The affair laid bare the deep-seated anti-Semitism within large layers of French society and made evident the corruption within the military. Herzl would later declare that it was the angry mobs marching through Paris after Dreyfus's conviction chanting "Death to the Jews" that had brought about his change of heart. It was then he realized that if there was no future for Jews in France, the country where Jewish emancipation had first been achieved, there would be none for them anywhere in Europe. It is a fine story, one that later lent Herzl an almost prophetic air, but it was, in all likelihood, a fabrication. Because neither in the newspaper articles he wrote for the Neue Freie Presse, nor in his diaries is there any indication that he was entirely convinced of Dreyfus's innocence, or that he regarded his conviction as the culmination of French anti-Semitism. Nor did he mention the anti-Semitic riots in Paris in his reporting. It was not until 1899, so a year after Émile Zola had written his famous article J'accuse, in which he condemned Esterhazy's acquittal, and the country had been divided into Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards, that Herzl seems to have developed a deep interest in the affair. The true reasons for Herzl's conversion are probably to be found in his homeland, Austria, and cannot be traced back to a single event. The growing and oftentimes aggressive nationalism amongst the various peoples of the Habsburg Empire deeply troubled him, as it threatened the cohesion of the liberal Austrian constitutional state. Attempts by the government to resolve the emerging conflicts through compromise and conciliation often went awry, as demonstrated by the riots following the Badeni reforms of 1897, since there was always a national group that somehow felt disadvantaged. He also recognized that the ethnic conflicts were having a negative impact on the Jewish population. In Bohemia and Moravia, for example, the Jewish minority found itself caught between a rock and a hard place, as neither the German nor the Czech nationalists were prepared to recognize them as part of their own group, instead resorting to anti-Semitic rhetoric. Polish and Hungarian nationalists too often adopted an anti-Semitic stance, accusing them of being loyal solely to the Habsburg Empire or to an enemy ethnic group. Another cause for concern for Herzl was racial anti-Semitism, espoused above all by German nationalists. On this subject he wrote in 1897, "German-educated Jews who grew up and reached adulthood while liberal ideas were at their height wholeheartedly adhered to the German nation. They loved their German identity deeply and ardently served the German people, as well as the idea of civic liberty. Then, suddenly, the Germans withdrew. Suddenly, they declared the Jews to be parasites sucking the lifeblood of the German race. The scene changed abruptly, as sudden as awakening from a dream. They were flabbergasted. Everything they knew appeared to be a mistake. Their entire life plans turned out to be based on fundamental errors. The sacrifices they had made were for naught, their patriotism squandered. And last but not least, he was shaken by the news of Karl Lueger's election success in Vienna, which Lueger owed, amongst other things, to his hate campaign against his Jewish fellow citizens. In short, Herzl's world and everything he had stood for came crashing down. In the event that the Austrian constitutional system were indeed to collapse, Herzl needed a solution. It was not long before he presented his vision to the public in 1896 with the publication of his pamphlet, The Jew State. In his introduction, Herzl declared that the assimilation of European Jews into the surrounding societies had failed. But perhaps we could blend in without a trace amongst the people surrounding us, if only we were left in peace for 2 generations. We will not be left in peace. After brief periods of tolerance, hostility towards us flares up again and again. Our well-being seems to contain something provocative, because for many centuries, the world has been accustomed to seeing in us the most despised of the poor. He saw the solution in the Jews finally recognizing themselves as a nation in their own right and establishing a new state for themselves in a distant corner of the world. We are a people. The enemy forces us to be so against our will, as has always been the case throughout history. In times of adversity, we stand together, and that is when we suddenly discover our strength. Yes, we have the strength to form a state. Indeed, a model state. We have all the human and material resources necessary to do so. Herzl was relatively indifferent as to where this state should be established. He argued that the Zionists should accept whatever was offered to them, but he had 2 favourites. On the one hand, Argentina, a sparsely populated country with favourable climatic conditions, and on the other, Palestine, the cradle of Judaism. Palestine is our unforgettable historical homeland. That name alone would be a tremendously stirring rallying cry for our people. If His Majesty the Sultan were to grant us Palestine, we would undertake to put Turkey's finances in order. For Europe, we would form a bulwark against Asia there. We would provide the cultural outpost against barbarism. As a neutral state, we would remain in alliance with the whole of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. This passage clearly shows how strongly Herzl was influenced by the colonial ideas prevalent at the time, and that he had little regard for the cultures of the Middle East. Herzl considered it impossible that the indigenous population of Palestine might have any objections to this project, for he had nothing less in mind than a utopia. Herzl's book, which is titled Der Judenstaat in German, is often translated into English as The Jewish State. I cannot stress enough how grave of a mistranslation that is, as Herzl did not envisage a Jewish state at all, but rather a state for Jews. This is a significant difference, as the specifically Jewish aspect plays, if at all, only a symbolic role in Herzl's vision. Instead, Herzl wanted a progressive model state, in which persecuted European Jews could find asylum and build a better and fairer Europe in the Middle East. In this country, no one was to work more than 7 hours a day, which is why Herzl dubbed it the 7-hour land and designed a flag featuring 7 golden stars on a white background. This 7-hour land was to be an aristocratic republic, as neither a pure monarchy nor a democracy seemed desirable to him. As far as language was concerned, every resident should retain their mother tongue. Herzl therefore wanted to establish a sort of mini-Switzerland in which different languages of equal status would coexist. The use of Hebrew seemed out of the question for him. We cannot, after all, speak Hebrew to one another. Who among us knows enough Hebrew to ask for a train ticket in that language, he wrote. He also rejected other Jewish languages such as Yiddish, Ladino and Judeo-Arabic, albeit for different reasons. We shall wean ourselves off the stunted and stifled jargon we now use, these ghetto languages. They are the clandestine languages of prisoners. According to Herzl, the 7-hour land was to combine all the best elements of Europe so that all new arrivals could feel right at home. Anyone who has seen something of the world knows that it is precisely these small, everyday habits that can already be easily transplanted anywhere. Indeed, the technical achievements of our time, which this plan seeks to put to use for humanity, have so far been employed chiefly for these small habits. There are English hotels in Egypt and on the mountain peaks of Switzerland, Viennese cafes in South Africa, French theatres in Russia, German operas in America, and the finest Bavarian beer in Paris. In every local community, everyone can and will find their own little habits again, only better, more beautiful, and more pleasant. Herzl's fantastical ideas were met with little approval amongst Vienna's Jewish community. In his famous book, The World of Yesterday, Stefan Zweig recounted the outrage that the Jew state had provoked. "What on earth," they said gruffly, "has got into this otherwise so clever, witty and cultured writer? What sort of nonsense is he getting up to and writing? Why should we go to Palestine? Our language is German, not Hebrew. Our homeland is beautiful Austria. Are we not doing splendidly under the good Emperor Franz Joseph? Do we not have a decent livelihood, a secure position? Are we not citizens with equal rights, long established and loyal citizens of this beloved Vienna? And are we not living in a progressive age which will do away with all religious prejudices within a few decades? Why does he, who speaks as a Jew and wishes to help Judaism, hand arguments to our worst enemies and try to set us apart, when every day brings us closer and more intimately connected to the German world?" Herzl refused to be deterred by the lack of support from the Viennese Jewish community and set about organising a Zionist Congress. Initially he had hoped to hold it in Munich, but both the German Rabbinical Association and the Munich Jewish community protested vehemently against this idea. And so Herzl changed his plan and chose the Swiss city of Basel instead, where he did not expect much resistance. However, he was not entirely without allies, as both the famous Viennese architect Oskar Marmorek and the writer Max Nordau threw their support behind this cause. Marmorek had first seriously doubted the possibility of Jewish integration following Lueger's election as mayor, and was subsequently won over to the Zionist cause during a dinner with Herzl. Max Nordau, who, like Herzl, had originally come from Pest, had also become disillusioned by the rising tide of antisemitism and had already met with Herzl in Paris in the early 1890s. He was later to become his most important ally. Together the three planned the Zionist Congress, which then took place at the City Casino in Basel at the end of August 1897. Over 200 delegates took part, around a quarter of them from Russia. The Congress resulted in the founding of the Zionist organization and the adoption of the Basel Program. It was very concise and included the following points. Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. The Congress contemplates the following means to the attainment of this end. 1. The promotion by appropriate means of the settlement in Palestine of Jewish farmers, artisans and tradesmen. 2. The organisation and uniting of the whole of Jewry by means of appropriate local and overall events, in accordance with the country's laws. 3. The strengthening and fostering of Jewish national sentiment and national consciousness. 4. Preparatory steps towards obtaining the consent of the government, where necessary, in order to reach the goals of Zionism. It is interesting that this program made hardly any reference to Herzl's Jew state and was extremely vague in its objectives. The Congress participants deliberately left open whether their aim should be an independent Jewish state or an autonomous region within the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, the Congress was a resounding success for Herzl, as he had established himself as the leader of the Zionist movement. Although he had not been the first to invent Zionism, he possessed the organizational talent and the drive to build a political movement that could be taken seriously. After the Congress had ended, Herzl wrote in his diary with satisfaction, "If I were to sum up the Basel Congress in a single word, one which I shall be careful not to utter in public, it would be this: in Basel I founded the Jewish state." If I were to say that out loud today, I would be met with universal derision. Perhaps in 5 years' time, or certainly in 50, everyone will come to realize it. Even though looking back his words now seem almost prophetic, at the time he was in fact met with little more than universal derision. The most scathing criticism came from Karl Kraus, who published a pamphlet in 1898 entitled A Crown for Zion, in which he expressed his opposition to Herzl and the idea of Zionism. In it, Kraus described the Zionists as Jewish anti-Semites, as they emphasized the distinctive characteristics of the Jews as a supposed nation, and agreed with the most virulent anti-Semitic voices that the Jews should leave Europe. He also accused the Zionists of fueling anti-Semitic stereotypes and blocking the path to assimilation, which he believed was the only way to resolve the Jewish question. He felt his stance was reinforced by the fact that in Austria, the Social Democratic Workers' Party was gaining ever greater momentum, led by Viktor Adler, a former Jew who had converted to Protestantism. Kraus saw the transformation from a conflict of nationalities to a class conflict and the introduction of universal suffrage as the best way to deprive rampant anti-Semitism of its breeding ground. They, he means the Zionists, have succeeded in gradually convincing Christians, who until now had taken no pleasure whatsoever in anti-Semitism, of the beneficial nature of the idea of separation. Because the Jewish type has attracted the ridicule of the utterly stupid through certain physical stigmata, our staunch, at-any-cost Jews take pride in emphasizing these stigmata in particular, and it is precisely against that vulgar anti-Semitism, which lashed out with redoubled force at the curve of the nasal bone, that they set all their holy religious zeal in opposition. These days there is a certain merit in not having a straight nose, and one cannot hold it in high enough esteem for that reason. These are the gentlemen who will never admit that economic anti-Semitism will be absorbed by social democracy, which equalizes everything, including noses, who cannot bear the thought that the German nationalists, fully occupied in the struggle against the Slavs and the clericals, might, in the interest of political prudence, set aside the foolish Jewish question. It is precisely in Austria, where party strife at times stifles interest in the Jewish question, that this type has unfolded in all its grotesque obtrusiveness. Kraus gave Herzl the nickname King of Zion, and this name was to become firmly established in Vienna's Jewish cultural circles. Whenever Herzl went to the theatre, which he did often and with great pleasure, it was considered good form for the other Jewish audience members to put their heads together and whisper to one another, "The king has arrived." Yet even otherwise he found hardly any supporters amongst the Viennese Jews. For example, although he was not fundamentally opposed to the idea of Jewish colonization of Palestine, Rabbi Moritz Gudemann distanced himself from Herzl following the outcry caused by the Jew state. Even Herzl's bosses at the Neue Freie Presse, who were themselves Jewish, refused to give Zionism any platform in their newspaper. Instead, they remained completely silent on the subject. What is more, the membership of the Zionist organization, which had its headquarters in the Austrian capital after all, numbered just 862 in Vienna. Herzl quickly realized that he would find no large following in his hometown. For this reason, he sought supporters in other parts of Europe, hoping above all to win the sympathy of European rulers, whom he attempted to persuade through diplomatic channels. He saw his greatest hope for this in the German Empire, and indeed he managed to secure 2 audiences with Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1898, whilst the emperor was on his tour of the Orient. However, these discussions came to nothing, not least because of the strongly negative stance taken by the Reich Chancellor, Bernhard von Bülow, who wanted nothing to do with such an idea. Attempts to negotiate with the Ottoman Sultan, Abdülhamid II, also came to nothing. Although Herzl was indeed granted an audience in 1901, the Sultan refused to make any concrete concessions to Herzl that went beyond meaningless platitudes. His liaison with Great Britain proved far more successful. In 1903, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, offered Herzl a territory in East Africa, present-day Kenya, where European Jews could settle. Just as Herzl believed he had finally achieved his goal, this Uganda scheme backfired on him, as most other members of the Zionist organization had no interest in settling in Africa. For them, only Palestine was an option. And so Herzl had to start from scratch again, but he did not give up. In August 1903, he travelled to Russia, where he was enthusiastically received by the Jewish population. He met with the Russian Minister of the Interior, Vyacheslav von Plehve, who, however, could promise him little more than to support the Zionist cause in Constantinople. Further meetings with King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy or Pope Pius X also failed to yield any constructive results. In 1902, Herzl published his novel The Old New Land, which got translated into Hebrew as Tel Aviv, and in which his vision of a model state in Palestine had finally become a reality. It was a peaceful country without an army, built on humanitarian principles and upholding egalitarian values. Herzl himself was no doubt aware that his old new land was an almost too perfect society. Nevertheless, he remained firmly convinced right to the end that Zionism would make a better life possible, not only for the Jews but for the whole of humanity. In the introduction to his book, he therefore wrote, "If you will it, it is no fairy tale." Unfortunately for him, Herzl was not to live to see the founding of a Jewish state. He died in 1904 of a heart condition at the Spa of Edlach, aged just 44. In the 1920s, the famous Austrian writer Josef Roth wrote, "Modern Zionism originated in Austria, in Vienna. It was founded by an Austrian journalist. No one else could have founded it." Indeed, Vienna may have been the birthplace of the Zionist movement, but it never became a Zionist stronghold. Still, there was no shortage of attempts by the local Zionists to change this. They began to organize themselves in the city districts with a significant Jewish population and established educational institutions such as the Toynbee Hall, where lectures were given and reading circles held to strengthen Jewish national consciousness. Younger people, and students in particular, were drawn to the Zionist cause, leading to increasingly frequent clashes between Jewish students and anti-Semitic fraternity members. However, the Zionists' greatest opponents remained the integrationists led by Josef Bloch and the Austrian Israelite Union. They regarded themselves as the true defenders of Jewish interests and from the late 1890s onwards pursued a strategy of taking anti-Semites to court for defamation. From the very outset, the integrationists and Zionists were at loggerheads and hurled fierce insults at one another. Whilst the Zionists described the integrationists as naive, deluded and corrupt, the integrationists responded by branding the Zionists as demagogic, unworldly dreamers. Although both sides were the most prominent Jewish representatives, neither had the support of the majority of Vienna's Jewish community. Not even 10% of Jews were members of Bloch's union, while the Zionists were able to rally only a paltry fraction of that number behind them. The majority of Vienna's Jews felt they belonged either to the established liberal parties or, increasingly, to the Social Democrats. With their argument that anti-Semitism and nationalism would automatically disappear with the establishment of a classless society in which everyone enjoyed equal rights, they were able to win over many Viennese Jews. Another factor in their favour was that the Social Democrats, in their 1899 Brünn or Brno program, in which they called for the transformation of the Habsburg Empire into a democratic federal state of nations, did not recognise the Jews as a nation, but rather as integral members of their surrounding cultures. In the 1907 parliamentary elections, these differing views could vie for the support of Vienna's Jewish community, because for the very first time, all men above 24 years could vote in free, secret and equal elections. The Jewish nationalists and the Zionists worked together and fielded candidates in Bukovina, Galicia and some districts of Vienna. Isidor Shalit stood as a candidate for Leopoldstadt, the traditionally Jewish district. As the Zionists had the best chances there, they launched an aggressive press campaign in Leopoldstadt portraying Shalit as a proud and sincere Jew, whilst his rivals were labelled reactionary or un-Jewish. And it was all to no avail. Although the Zionists from Galicia and Bukovina managed to send 4 members to the Imperial Council, the result in Vienna itself was disastrous. Shalit lost the election to the left-liberal social politician Julius Ofner. In any case, Vienna was dominated by the mass parties, namely the Christian Socials and the Social Democrats, whilst the established German liberal or nationalist parties were barely able to gain any significant support. The Zionists themselves secured a mere 529 votes. Until the fall of the Habsburg Empire, the Zionists were unable to convince the majority of Vienna's Jews of the righteousness of their cause. Not only were most of Vienna's Jews deeply attached to their homeland and home city, but the Zionists also lacked organizational skills, charismatic leadership, and convincing arguments. Added to this was the fact that, with the booming economy from the start of the 20th century, anti-Semitic agitation noticeably subsided, and that following Luiga's death in 1910, The Christian Social Party suffered a significant decline in Vienna at the hands of the Social Democrats. The spectre of anti-Semitism seemed to have been banished, and even the anti-Semitic newspapers were steadily losing readers. Zionism had failed in Vienna, but in the Russian Empire it became a mass movement. There, anti-Semitism had by no means abated, quite the contrary. In 1903, a horrific pogrom took place in Chisinau, or Chisinau, in which 49 Jews were killed and hundreds injured. 2 years later, following the October Manifesto of 1905, hundreds of pogroms broke out all over Ukraine, resulting in over 800 deaths. Many Eastern European Jews no longer saw a future for themselves in Russia and longed for a new home where they could live undisturbed. Many of them had already emigrated to the USA, but now, thanks to the Zionists, Palestine also presented itself as a possible destination for emigration. However, there was no such thing as one Zionism. Instead, the movement had already split into various factions during Herzl's lifetime. Whilst everyone could agree on the goal, which is the establishment of a homeland for Jews in Palestine, there was little consensus on what form this should take. Herzl envisaged a peaceful, progressive society in which Jews and Arabs would live side by side and build a mini-Europe of sorts. Echad Ha'am, a journalist who hailed from Ukraine, offered a different perspective. Unlike Herzl, he actually wanted to build a Jewish state and establish a Jewish cultural center in Palestine. It was not enough for him simply to create a refuge for European Jews fleeing anti-Semitism. Rather, he wanted to create a self-assured Jewish people who would build their own country and speak Hebrew as a common language. Later, the Zionist movement split even further, into a religious faction that sought to accord the Jewish religion a special role in the new state, into a socialist faction that advocated the ideal of collective agricultural settlements and called for the abolition of capitalism, a revisionist faction centered on the writer Vladimir Zhybotinsky, which held bourgeois, anti-socialist and nationalist positions and later called for the creation of a Greater Israel with a Jewish majority, and finally the pragmatic General Zionist faction, which sought to remain above the party struggles. The most important figure in the latter group was Chaim Weizmann, a chemist originally from Belarus who conducted research at the University of Manchester. Through his contacts in the British government, he succeeded in securing the adoption of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which promised the Jews a national home in Palestine. The road to the establishment of a Jewish state was still to be a long and bloody one, but on the 14th of May 1948 the moment had finally arrived. After the United Nations had approved the partition plan for the former British Mandate of Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish and an Arab state, David Ben-Gurion read out the Israeli Declaration of Independence at the Tel Aviv City Museum. Hanging above him was a portrait of Theodor Herzl, who, in Basel in 1897, had predicted the establishment of a Jewish state within 50 years. Herzl did not live to see the establishment of Israel, and the state that eventually emerged reflected his vision only in part. Israel is a functioning, albeit flawed, democratic state which, particularly when compared with other states in the Middle East, is extremely successful economically and technologically advanced. However, it is by no means a harmonious and peace-loving model state, for to this day its Arab citizens have not yet been fully integrated, and the status of the occupied territories is unlikely to be resolved in the near future. It is particularly tragic that Herzl's frankly naive notion that the 7-hour land could simply be established without resistance from the local population did not come true. From the end of the First World War to the present day, the land has been shaped by an enduring conflict between Jews and Palestinian Arabs that has repeatedly erupted into violence and war. The current war in Gaza, which followed Hamas's massacre of Israeli civilians on the 7th of October 2023, and in the course of which the entire Gaza Strip was mercilessly razed to the ground by the Israeli government as part of an ongoing genocide, has once again demonstrated how far the region remains from the peaceful future Herzl believed to be possible. As the historian and expert on Zionism Michael Brenner emphasized in a newspaper article from 2022, Herzl's Zionism was a liberation movement for an oppressed minority. It therefore certainly had its raison d'être, because as we've seen, it emerged at a time when anti-Semitism in Western Europe had reached its preliminary peak, and when many Jews lost their faith that emancipation and assimilation alone could guarantee their safety. It is also difficult to imagine that the founding of the State of Israel as we know it would have been conceivable without Nazism and the Holocaust. For it was only through the conviction that only a Jewish state could prevent further crimes against the Jewish people that the international community agreed to the creation of Israel. This naturally raises the legitimate question of why the Palestinian Arabs, of all people, should have to pay the price for the injustices committed by non-Jewish Europeans against Jewish Europeans. Lasting peace in the Middle East will probably only be achieved once the Palestinians too are given justice, whether in the form of a state of their own or a secular confederation. But exactly how such a peace can be achieved, especially after all that Hamas and the Israeli government have done, is something hardly anyone can say. We can only hope that, unlike Herzl's Old New Land, this won't turn out to be merely a dream. Alright then, dankeschön for watching until the end. If you liked what you saw, a thumbs up and a quick tap on the subscribe button would be highly appreciated. I also wanted to let you know that I have a Patreon account where you can support me if you have the means to do so and you want to help me make more videos like this in the future. In exchange, you'll be given access to my Patreon exclusive Discord server full of very lovely people where you can chat with me and with others, and depending on your support tier, some additional benefits like getting to see the upcoming videos much earlier than everyone else. In any case, I want to give a special shout out to my biggest supporters, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Marius Gerling, Leader Titan, Der Dicke Flipper, Defender, Azaraji, Lucy Tara I, Hrabienka Horadska, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drole, Wienweh, Lal Furphy, Yin, Big Dave, Folling, Turthambone, Super Noodle, Saparowski, Dominik Schwiderski, Agu Salinski, Chasey Lin, Noisdia, and Ryan Jones. I'm very grateful for your support. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.